Thank you, everybody, for joining for this last um, presentation on ages of conflict. And what I was going to try to do today is take a look, both take a look into the future of our current situation and discuss our current situation, but also compare it to the last age of conflict, which we came out of successfully, and compare the challenges then with the challenges we have now. Um, I will confess to you that a lot my mood about our current situation fluctuates from day to day and sometimes from hour to hour. Um, when I think about where we are now in the context of my own personal experiences, um, I'm very optimistic. I say that because my own experiences, our experiences with Sarah and this community, this state, this nation has been extraordinary. And I was telling Sue and some others that Sally and I have had there's 4 or 5 couples, I forget how many now, 4 at least, that we've met through the ABA Corporate Laws Committee and that we've vacationed with, and they are all conservatives. One was the chief of staff of the last conservative prime minister in Canada. Another was offered the SEC, head of the SEC position in the Trump administration. Another's a Texas corporate lawyer, Trump supporter, and yet our experience with all of them has been that we can reason our way through things and work together and find solutions. And so, reflecting on our own personal experiences, I feel very optimistic. And then, like today, I usually try to listen to, if not an equal amount of Fox, I usually listen to Fox podcasts to try to get a sense of what's being said. And the podcast is more reasoned and thoughtful, less extreme than some of their than the primetime commentators like Hannity and others. But today I listened to the news broadcast and heard about what's happening in the Republican Party and the seeming inability of the party to break away from Trump. And then I listened to an interview with Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, and it just about makes me despair of any possibility of ever making any progress. So I apologize for what may be my volatile moods or that may be reflected in this presentation. In any event, let's go. And I'm going to try to save 10 minutes at the end to play 10 minutes of a speech that Theresa May, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, gave at the Chatham House March of last year, or March of 2019. So let me recap and try to frame the question. Under the theories that we talked about, the central cause of conflict in an age of conflict is increasing institutional dysfunction. If that's a correct diagnosis, then the central cure in an age of conflict is reform of the institutions so that they work. And the central tension in an age of conflict is between an effort at reform, and reform can come from the right, the left, the middle. And in fact, I think reform probably needs to come from all those places. But if reform fails and the institutions remain or become increasingly dysfunctional, then there's a great temptation to resort to authoritarianism or coercion. And that coercion can come from either side. It can be a coercion that comes from the left to try to coerce change. The Russian Revolution and the subsequent dominance of the communists in Russia was, in my view at least, the Russian civilization was in an age of conflict, and it was resolved by an authoritarian response from the left to coerce change. Or it can come from the right. And while it's not easy to exactly categorize the fascism in Italy or in Germany, I would say predominantly it was a reactionary movement to try to preserve the status quo, although Hitler initiated a tremendous change in Germany that in the early years, in the 1930s, were quite beneficial to the German people that were included within the Aryan race. So I'm asking the question, what are the critical attributes needed for reform? And there are two I wanted to talk about, at least initially. And I wouldn't have thought I needed to talk about either of them, but now I think our situation is such that we do. One is truth and the other is leadership and courage. So why is truth important? Well, if we're going to reform matters, then we have to try to come to a reasonably an accurate perception of what our current reality is, and try to come to an accurate perception of what's not working. And I would ask in each of these areas that Quigley has articulated of human institutions, political, military, economic, intellectual, social, and religious, what worked in the past? Is it working now? If not, why not? How do we fix it? But not only is truth necessary for that reason, but in that battle between reform and authoritarianism, destroying truth is a critical weapon of authoritarianism. In fact, I once read an article that discussed the Soviet manual for instigating civil unrest to overthrow an incumbent regime. And of course, the Soviets, for 20 years after World War II, were intent on trying to overthrow regimes all over the world and institute communist regimes. So they became they developed something of an expertise in how to destabilize other nations. And the most important thing was related to truth, and it wasn't a matter of having their truth prevail over competing truths. It was a matter of causing people to think that there was no source from which they could get the truth. They would just give up on ever trying to discern what the truth is. Well, there was a recent article written by a history professor at Yale in the New York Times called The American Abyss. And he wrote this. I think this line is just so telling. Post-truth is pre-fascism. And Trump has been our post-truth president. When we give up on truth, we concede power to those with wealth and charisma to create spectacle in its place. Without agreement about some basic facts, citizens cannot form the civil society that would allow them to defend themselves. So, how do we find truth? What is truth? Well, this is where I think Western civilization has, for all of its flaws, I think Western civilization, which has, at least according to Quigley, reformed itself 3 times in the past, has been able to reform itself because of a perception of truth. And now I have managed to delete the key sentence that I wanted to read to you. But the key sentence is that truth unfolds in time through a communal process. Truth unfolds in time through a communal process. Unfolds in time. What does that mean? That means that we don't yet know all of the truth. We're in a constant process of finding the truth. But it also implies a sort of hope that we will find the truth. And then the very use of the word truth evidences a belief that there is something that is an objective reality, that we're not trapped in the matrix maze, living in some manipulated dream. So, and no one at the present time has the whole truth. That, of course, is critical. None of us know all of the truth. Each of us has some part of it, including the people that we disagree with. They have some part of it. And so finding truth is accomplished through a communal process of interaction. It's a competitive communal process, but truth emerges from a pluralistic debate. I just think that and I'll say this, that the truth, that vision of truth comes out of Christianity. It seems to me that Christianity, I don't know enough about other religions, but it seems to me at least that Christianity has a uniquely forward-looking vision of truth. It's a religion that was built on the crucifixion of someone and the hope and expectation that at some point in the future, God would return to us, that truth would be revealed to us, that justice would prevail. And so I think that vision of truth, of Christianity, and of course the version of Christianity that we inherited was a version of Christianity that came out of a mixture of cultural streams. And so it had to have an appreciation of the many different sources of truth. I think that concept of truth underlies democracy, because democracy is built on the perception that collectively, that none of us none of us alone or no group of us has a monopoly on the truth, and the truth is best found through a collective process of people exercising their democratic rights. And that if that process is working effectively, and we have challenges now as to whether it is, but if that process is working effectively, it comes to the best approximation of truth that's available. There's a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, which shows through a host of different experimentations that crowds tend to produce a better perception of reality than any single person or group. So democracy is built on that. I think free markets are also built on that. And as I said in the first class, I think that one of the successes of Western civilization in reforming itself is based on democracy. Because democracies, if the problem is that you've got institutions that are dysfunctional and you need to cure them, then you need a system that is responsive to people's need for change. And that is, at its best, a democratic system. And the old adage, it's a flawed system, but it's better than the alternatives. The same is true of free markets when they're operating properly within the context of a regulated structure that takes into account when markets operate well and when markets don't operate well. And if we can't have either without some basic understanding of truth And if we are without truth, we are in a much worse position in terms of reform, and much more likely to develop an authoritarian result. The other thing I want to talk about is leadership and courage. I said here, the importance of leadership in an imperfect world. Sally and I have had an ongoing conversation of years on the question of, are people good? And of course, Sally thinks everybody's good. I have a little more, shall I say, nuanced approach. I think that there's some percentage of people, say 10%, 20%, use those percentages, they're sort of arbitrary, that are courageous, that they will do the right thing no matter what the cost to them, no matter how challenging. And then there are the 10 or 20% of people are sociopaths or psychopaths. They're completely indifferent to good or right, and they're solely focused on themselves. And then there's the 80% of us, and I include myself in the 80%. We want to do the right thing. And we have a conscience that urges us to do the right thing. But we are not, we're not real courageous. And it doesn't take a lot of incentives or disincentives to deflect us from doing the right thing. And that's where our social structures and leadership in particular comes into play. And I don't mean just leadership at the very top. I mean leadership in every institution or social structure that we are in. Because if that leadership rewards people for doing what they think is right, and doesn't punish people for doing what they think is right, because I can tell you in most every institution that I've ever been involved in, it is the inclination of the leadership to punish those that disagree with it. So to have leadership that can not only tolerate but promote a dialogue and debate and be open to those who disagree with it is special. And it's that, and that is why leadership is so important, because with the right structures and the right leadership, the 80% of us who want to do the right thing, but are perhaps not heroes, will do the right thing. And I learned something when Sarah came out, and I've told people this, that one of the things I learned is that if everybody has a little bit of courage, no one needs to be a hero. And I learned that because so many of our friends and so many people in our community had a little bit of courage to come out and embrace us and support us. And as a result of that, none of us needed to be a hero. And that's what we need for all the people that want to do the right thing. Another thing is, courage is time sensitive. The longer we delay doing the right thing, the longer we empower the wrong impulses, the harder it becomes, the more courage that's needed to undo or to do the right thing. I look at to me, Nazi Germany, or Germany in the 1930s, was a perfect example of that. Hitler in 1928, the Nazi Party actually got up to, and I forget the exact numbers, but I'm going to say the low teens in the early 20s, because there was an economic crisis at that time. You know, a lot of people have visions of Germany with money in their wheelbarrows and you know, because there was rampant inflation. That actually was not the Depression. That was not the period of time that actually brought the Nazis to power, that was in the early 20s. And at that time, the Nazis rose, the size of the group rose to, I think, into the early teens. The economy corrected. The economy corrected, and Hitler and the Nazi Party's percentage of the population dropped to actually 2.8% at the peak of the economic boom in 1928. And then, of course, the crash came. And by 1932, 33, the Nazis were in the mid-30s. If people had had a little bit of courage to suppress the Nazis in 1928, 29, or 30, they wouldn't have had to have been a hero to try to suppress them in 33, 34, 35, and go on. So the sooner we exercise a little bit of courage, the better it will be, and the easier it will be to do the right thing. And this brings me to that poem that I'm sure so many of us love, what Amanda Gorman gave during the inaugural. And she wrote, "When day comes, we will step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. The new dawn blooms as we free it. We free the new dawn." And this is the best. "For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it." And that I believe is true. And the question is, how brave do we need to be? How brave will we be? And the next thing I wanted to talk about is, and I'll be partisan here, I think that Donald Trump is the authoritarian response, although I think Trump is not a very effective. He's very effective in terms of rallying a crowd and his showmanship and his sense of charisma, but he's very undisciplined, and he has, I don't think, any sense of how to build an organization, because he never builds up any sort of reciprocal loyalty to people that are immediately around him, because he ultimately turns on all of them when he perceives that they disagree with him at all. But someday we may have a Trump we may have a more efficient and effective Trump. And so I'm asking myself, how do we deal with the situation we're in now, and particularly when we talk about unity and dialogue? And I took a line from President Biden's inaugural address, and he said, "Through Civil War, the Great Depression, World War, 9/11, through struggle, sacrifice, and setbacks, our better angels have always prevailed." Taking that line from Lincoln's first inaugural address, which actually wasn't written. That line was not written by Lincoln. It was written by Seward, who gave it to Lincoln. In each of these moments, enough of us have come together to carry all of us forward. And what I think is critical there, enough of us have come together. He's not talking about all of us coming together. He's realistic enough to know we all aren't going to come together. But what we need to do is for enough of us to come together. So how does that happen? How do enough of us come together to defeat the authoritarian response and reform what needs to be reformed? Well, I ask myself that question of certainly there is no dialogue with, and there could be no unity with white supremacists. I don't really think that there can be a dialogue with or any unity with those who would seek to overthrow the government, whether for racial reasons or whatever reasons, and those who would seek to undo the electoral process. My hard question is, what about those who will not disavow Trump? Because it's almost mind-boggling to think what he attempted to accomplish and how close he came to accomplishing the undoing of an election. There was an excellent article I read, and I can't remember where, but it was talking about what prevented Trump from undoing our election. And the author of the article said it wasn't our institutions. Congress didn't stop him from doing it. The courts, while they did do some things that slowed the pace, didn't really stop him from doing it until the very end. But what stopped him from doing it were a bunch of individuals like the Secretary of State of Georgia and a Republican on the election board in Michigan, who, despite tremendous pressure, just refused to do the wrong thing. And this author was saying that if any one of the individuals who stood at those crossroads and had the courage to do the right thing had instead gone the other way, it could have created a momentum that would have resulted in Republican legislators in swing states actually attempting to undo the election as Trump wanted them to. I mean, it's almost unfathomable to think that could happen in this country. But what's even more unfathomable is what Trump did with the people that he called to Washington on January 6th. And I listened to Senator Scott today said, "Oh, President Trump, he did not want those people to go into the Capitol building. He didn't tell them to go into the Capitol building." Well, what he told them was that if you march to the Capitol, you can prevent Joe Biden from becoming president of the United States. Well, we knew that the Congress was not going to do that because the Democrats had control of the House. There was no way there was going to be legislative action, however illegitimate. There was no way there was going to be legislative action to undo that election, no matter how many marchers were outside, no matter how loud they yelled, no matter how long they marched. It wasn't going to happen. There was only one way. If Trump was serious, and I think he was, there was only one way that those marchers, when he sent them off to Capitol Hill, could stop Joe Biden from becoming president on Joe Biden's election from being finally and completely confirmed on January 6th. And that was by breaking into the building and physically preventing the Congress from doing that. And that is exactly what he tried to do. And then, after they did it, after he knew that they were in the Capitol building chanting to murder the vice president, he actually encouraged them in tweets to do just that. It's unbelievable. So there's only two ways to deal with this. Either the Republican Party has to reform itself, or the Republican Party has to be defeated, or I think then we will go down an authoritarian course. So what are the chances of the Republican Party reforming itself? I was pretty optimistic 4 or 5 days ago that business interests in particular would force the Republican Party, by threatening to cut off donations, if nothing else, to disavow Trump. It seems And when Mitch McConnell said that Donald Trump incited the riot, based on a lie, I thought, oh my God, they're going to reform themselves. Well, now it would appear that's not going to happen. And if the Republican Party doesn't reform itself, it has a geographical advantage, not only in the Electoral College, but even more importantly even as importantly, they have an even bigger advantage in the Senate. It will be very difficult, unless there truly is the kind of blue wave that people were hoping for before this last election, for the Democrats to defeat the Republicans. And if the Republicans are still in the grip of Trump or Trumpism, that is going to be a very dangerous situation. In fact, right now, we have a Senate that's split 50-50, and yet the states represented by Democratic senators have 40 million more voters, not population, voters, than the ones represented by the Republicans. That's how imbalanced the Senate is, because each state gets 2 votes. So Wyoming has 2 votes, Delaware has 2 votes, and California has 2 votes. And when you structure it that way, the rural areas just have a tremendous power in the Senate, disproportionate to their proportion of the population. And that is why it's going to be so critical for the Democratic Party to try to figure out how to appeal to rural voters that the Democratic Party has largely ignored. If the Republican Party can't reform itself, then one other possibility is for Republicans to be attracted away from that party. And I read an article just today that there aren't many states that keep a daily count of the number of registration changes that are occurring in the state. But in those, I think there's maybe a dozen states that do. And since January 6th, there's been a greater transition of voters leaving the Republican Party and either becoming independents or going to some other party than these states have ever recorded in the past. I frankly don't know how far back their records go. And so who are the Republicans that we need to, who are the Republicans that we need to have a dialogue with? Well, to borrow Hillary Clinton's phrase, we're not going to have a meaningful dialogue with the deplorables. And by that, I mean not non-college educated whites who live in rural areas, most of whom I think are good, decent people, if misguided. I'm talking about the white supremacists and the people that would try to overthrow the government, the people that would try to overthrow an election. I think our best chance is with business conservatives, like the people that many of us know who are conservative business people, and they're Republicans, and they stuck with Trump, even though they weren't Trump fans going into the 2016 primaries. They maintained their unity, because Republicans are better at maintaining unity than the Democrats are, which reminds me, in Germany, Hitler had never had more than 35% of the population. But what he did have, he formed a unified front with conservatives and the military in Germany, while the left and the moderates in the left in Germany were splintering into all sorts of different groups. So it's critical for those who aren't Trump supporters to maintain their loyalty, their unity, and not fight each other as we did in 2016 between the Bernie bros and the Hillary supporters. How about religious activists? I just read a review of a frightening book called The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And this book recounts from the words and documents and interviews of the leaders of the Christian nationalist movement that they seek to take control of every element of government in order to elevate the Bible over the Constitution. If that's true, and I frankly have not confronted anyone that I know fits that description, but if that's true, then there may not be much room for a dialogue with that group.
Dave,
Yes.
I hate to interrupt you, but I think it would be better to say their interpretation of the Bible.
Yes, I agree, Greg. I absolutely agree. So how about the fate of the Biden administration? I heard Rick Wilson, who is one of the leaders of the Lincoln Project, the Republicans who have left the Republican Party and fought Trump, say that the fate of the Biden administration is going to be decided in the first 2 years, and it'll be based on the economy and the pandemic. And I would say, with respect to the pandemic, I'm sure we all are aware of the race we're in between getting enough people vaccinated fast enough and getting our mitigation efforts strong enough to dampen down the spread of this virus before it can continue to mutate to the point where it eventually will, if left unrestrained, mutate to the point of finding of developing a mutation that resists our vaccinations. And we now know that at least one of the vaccines that's about to come online that has a 90% effective rate against the current prevalent virus, which is about to be replaced in the United States even by the British version, had a 90% effective rate against that virus, but only a 48% effective rate against the South African virus. And so that's the race that we're in, and it's going to, and the good news is that the numbers have started to go down. I listened to a podcast yesterday from the New York Times from a science reporter who said that the number of cases are going down for one of two reasons, or maybe two reasons. One is better mitigation efforts. People are getting frightened enough to stay at home, and also because the estimation is that about a third of our population has now had the virus. Now, only about 10% have been diagnosed as having the virus, but the general belief among epidemiologists is that for every person that's been diagnosed as having the virus, there's probably three that have it, three others that have it that never were diagnosed. So this scientist was saying that they think that maybe about a third of our population has been infected, and that at that level, herd immunity begins to have some effect. The ability of the virus to replicate itself and spread starts to go down. So those two things are reasons for some optimism. In terms of the economy, of course, both the pandemic and I believe the fragility of our financial markets. I read an interesting statistic that the stock market has never gone up between the election day and inauguration day as much as it has for the Biden administration, never gone up more than that, except in one circumstance. Herbert Hoover, from election day to inauguration day. So I think there's a general realization that this market, almost by any metric, is at the very top of the valuation ranges that we typically experience. And it is absolutely true that overvaluations do not of themselves trigger a bear market. But what's also true is that when something does trigger a bear market, that market is more severe depending on how high the valuation levels were at the time the market was triggered. So that's another risk for Joe Biden. I'm going to skip this. These are statistics on the vote, the breakdown of the vote. I was going to discuss them in the context of who can be reached on the Trump side of the election. I came across these two quotes. The first one: "Here we are at the top of the world. We have arrived at this peak to stay there forever. There is, of course, this thing called history. But history is something unpleasant that happens to other people." And that was Arnold Toynbee recalling the 1897 Diamond Jubilee celebration of Queen Victoria. So when we go back to prior ages of conflict, the prior age of conflict that was the age that started developing in the late 1800s and culminated first it got even worse in the First World War, and then the Great Depression and the Second World War. And ages of conflict are the best of times, at least particularly at the beginning of an age of conflict. They're the best of times and they're the worst of times, because you're at the point where everything seems to be going well. So the second is a paraphrase quote from the book The End of History and the Last Man, written by a gentleman who was then a professor at Johns Hopkins. He's now at Stanford. But he wrote that when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. In other words, we were, as Toynbee said of Great Britain in 1897, at the top of the world, and we were going to be there forever. So it's that period that I wanted to look at in terms of historical parallels. And boy, I'm running out of time. So let me just say that every problem that we confront today, economic, political, social, intellectual, existed in the last age of conflict in Western civilization, and we overcame it. The biggest difference is that in the last two ages of conflict, the authoritarian response, which in the age of conflict during the American Revolution and the French Revolution culminated in the authoritarian response of Napoleonic France, and the age of conflict that culminated in an authoritarian response in Nazi Germany, were both defeated by parts of Western civilization that were outside of the core areas, that core area of the civilization that had become corrupted and had become authoritarian. So in the first, Napoleonic France was defeated by Great Britain. Nazi Germany was defeated, well, primarily actually, it's probably primarily defeated by a different civilization, the Russian civilization, the Soviet Union. But it was also defeated, and the post-war world was created by the United States. A problem for us now is there is no part of Western civilization that one might look to and say, that's where our salvation is going to come from, unless, in my hopes, it's Canada, or maybe Australia or New Zealand. So probably our only hope is to reform ourselves And that has, history has very few examples of that happening. It's going to be a tremendous accomplishment. And it's going to be an accomplishment that is not going to happen in 4 days, 4 weeks, 4 years, maybe 40 years. Maybe our children will finally be able to accomplish that. But it can be done. We've overcome these kinds of problems in the past. And I still think if we stick to our Western ideals, as imperfectly as they have been applied, I think we can do that. And on one last point, and then I want to play a speech by Theresa May, if you guys have 10 minutes to hear it. I want to talk about historical contingency, because when you look at history this way, it all looks like it's sort of this process that was moving along and going to end up wherever it was going to end up. In terms of historical contingency, one of the things, I'll mention Hitler. Hitler came to power in Germany but when he was made chancellor of the German state. He was made chancellor in 33 or 34. And very shortly, right after that, the popularity of the Nazi Party started to go down. If he had not been made chancellor at that point, there's a counter version of history that would have had the Nazi Party diminishing in its capacity, never able to take over all of Germany. How did he become chancellor? He became chancellor as a result of a couple of almost freakish events, but one of which was that Hindenburg, who was the president of Germany, realizing that the Reichstag was on the cusp of making Hitler chancellor because of a deal that Hitler had worked out with others, Hindenburg was going to dissolve the Reichstag and then call new elections. And one of his, I don't know what position he was, went to the Reichstag that day, was going to make a motion to dissolve the Reichstag. If he had made that motion, the Reichstag would have been dissolved and Hitler would not have become chancellor. Instead, I think it was Göring, was presiding over the Reichstag that day and kept looking away and pretended that he didn't see this person standing, raising his hand to try to make the declaration that would have dissolved the Reichstag. Instead, he recognized someone else in the Reichstag who moved for a vote of no confidence in Hindenburg, which passed. And then Hindenburg was forced to compromise and come to a resolution to put Hitler in as chancellor. That's the contingency of history. The other contingency I wanted to point out, and I listened to a fantastic podcast about other transitions in the American presidency, from the president leaving to the new president coming in. And they talked about FDR. And I never knew this. I had never heard of this. But FDR was almost assassinated between the election and the inaugural. I don't remember where he was at the time, but he was with a group, and a local group. And there was a gunman in the crowd. The gunman was about 25 feet away and actually got off 5 shots. As the gunman was about to pull the trigger, a woman in the crowd, I think, accidentally jostled him, bumped him, and caused his shots to miss FDR, but hit others, I think killing someone else in the crowd. And can you imagine what would happen, or what might have happened in the United States had FDR been assassinated that day? So history there's so many contingencies. Now I'll tell you, if you've got 10 minutes, why I wanted to play this speech from Theresa May. Because I think she doesn't use the word Western civilization, but she talks about what I've been trying to talk about in terms of our heritage and our heritage. But she's also an example of a conservative, albeit a British conservative, that I could vote for.
It's 8 o'clock.
Now, I'll ask, I can give you the site, or I can play it for you now if you've got 10 minutes and want to hear it. Sue, what should we do? And anybody that wants to leave, obviously can leave.
I say play it.
All right, let me see if I can. Now I got to find it. I hope it comes up. Is it on my screen? Do you guys see it?
Yeah.
See, yes, we do.
Okay, let me start it.
Looking at our own country and the world of which we form a part, and there's a great deal to feel optimistic about. Globally, over the last 30 years, extreme poverty and child mortality have both been halved. Hundreds of millions of people are today living longer, happier and healthier lives than their grandparents could even have dreamed of. As a world, we have never cared more deeply about the ecology of our planet's environment. From treating the Earth as a collection of resources to be plundered, we have, within a generation, come to understand its fragile diversity and taken concerted action to conserve it. The UK is leading the way in that effort with our commitment to net zero emissions. Social attitudes in our country and many other Western countries have transformed in recent decades. There are more women in senior positions today than at any time in history. When I was born, it was a crime to be a gay man, legal to discriminate on the basis of sex or race, and casual bigotry was a socially acceptable fact of daily life. All that has changed, and greatly for the better. There remains a long, long way to go to achieve what we should rightly seek, an economy, a society and a world that truly works for all of its people, where everyone has the security of a safe home and enough to eat, the opportunity to get a good education and a satisfying job to support their family, and the freedom of thought, speech and action to do and be everything their talents and hard work fit them for. The generation of young people growing up today in the UK and around the world have it within their grasp to achieve more in the decades ahead than we today can imagine. They will have the chance to harness the great drivers of change in the world today, from artificial intelligence and the data economy, cleaner forms of energy and more efficient modes of transport, to the technological and medical advances that will extend and improve our quality of life. The 21st century has the potential to be a pivotal point in human history, when economic, social and technological progress reach a combined apogee with the benefits multiplied and with everyone enjoying a share. It will not come about without effort. We will all have to work hard, individually and collectively, to reach that better future. Crucially, the full power and potential of a small but strong and strategic state must be brought to bear in that effort, establishing and maintaining the legal and economic structures that allow a regulated free market to flourish, coordinating its own interventions to maximum effect, supporting science and innovation, supplying crucial public services and infrastructure, leading and responding to social progress. At our best, that has been the story of the democratic century that we celebrated last year when we marked the first votes for women and working men in 1918. It has been democratic politics, an open market economy, and the enduring values of free speech, the rule of law, and a system of government founded on the concept of inviolable human rights that has provided the nexus of that progress in the past. And a healthy body politic will be essential to consolidating and extending that progress in the future. It is on that score that today we do have grounds for serious concern. Both domestically and internationally, in substance and in tone, I'm worried about the state of politics. That worry stems from a conviction that the values on which all of our successes have been founded cannot be taken for granted. They may look to us as old as the hills. We might think they will always be there. But establishing the superiority of those values over the alternatives was the hard work of centuries of sacrifice. And to ensure that liberal inheritance can endure for generations to come, we today have a responsibility to be active in conserving it. If we do not, we will all pay the price, rich and poor, strong and weak, powerful and powerless. As a politician, my decisions and actions have always been guided by that conviction. It used to be asked of applicants at Conservative candidate selection meetings, are you a conviction politician or are you a pragmatist? I've never accepted the distinction. Politics is the business of turning your convictions into reality to improve the lives of the people you serve. As a Conservative, I've never had any doubt about what I believe in: security, freedom and opportunity, decency, moderation, patriotism, conserving what is of value, but never shying away from change. Indeed, recognizing that often change is the way to conserve. Believing in business, but holding businesses to account if they break the rules. Backing ambition, aspiration, and hard work. Protecting our union of nations, and being prepared to act in its interest, even if that means steering a difficult political course. And remaining always firmly rooted in the common ground of politics, where all great political parties should be. I didn't write about those convictions in pamphlets or make many theoretical speeches about them. I've sought to put them into action. And actually getting things done, rather than simply getting them said, requires some qualities that have become unfashionable of late. One of them is a willingness to compromise. That does not mean compromising your values. It does not mean accepting the lowest common denominator or clinging to outmoded ideas out of apathy or fear. It means being driven by, and when necessary, standing up for your values and convictions, but doing so in the real world, in the arena of public life, where others are making their own case and pursuing their own interests, and where persuasion, teamwork, and a willingness to make mutual concessions are needed to achieve an optimal outcome. That is politics at its best. The alternative is a politics of winners and losers, of absolutes and of perpetual strife, and that threatens us all. Today, an inability to combine principles with pragmatism and make a compromise when required seems to have driven our whole political discourse down the wrong path. It has led to what is in effect a form of absolutism, one which believes that if you simply assert your view loud enough and long enough, you will get your way in the end, or that mobilizing your own faction is more important than bringing others with you. This is coarsening our public debate. Some are losing the ability to disagree without demeaning the views of others. Online, technology allows people to express their anger and anxiety without filter or accountability. Aggressive assertions are made without regard to the facts or the complexities of an issue, in an environment where the most extreme views tend to be the most noticed. This descent of our debate into rancour and tribal bitterness, and in some cases, even vile abuse at a criminal level, is corrosive for the democratic values which we should all be seeking to uphold. It risks closing down the space for reasoned debate and subverting the principle of freedom of speech. And this does not just create an unpleasant environment. Words have consequences, and ill words that go unchallenged are the first step on a continuum towards ill deeds, towards a much darker place where hatred and prejudice drive not only what people say, but also what they do. This absolutism is not confined to British politics. It festers in politics all across the world. We see it in the rise of political parties on the far left and far right in Europe and beyond. And we see it in the increasingly adversarial nature of international relations, which some view as a zero-sum game, where one country can only gain if others lose, and where power, unconstrained by rules, is the only currency of value. This absolutism at home and abroad is the opposite of politics at its best. It refuses to accept that other points of view are reasonable. It ascribes bad motives to those taking those different views. And it views anything less than 100% of what you want all the time as evidence of failure, when success in fact means achieving the optimum outcome in any given circumstance. The sustainability of modern politics derives not from an uncompromising absolutism, but rather through the painstaking marking out of a common ground. That doesn't mean abandoning our principles, far from it. It means delivering on them with the consent of people on all sides of the debate, so they can ultimately accept the legitimacy of what is being done, even if it may not be the outcome they would initially have preferred. And that is how social progress and international agreement was forged in the years after the Second World War, both at home with the establishment of an enduring National Health Service, and internationally with the creation of an international order based on agreed rules and multilateral institutions.
Let me see if I can stop the screen sharing. Okay. What she said, except here's my conundrum. What she said I shouldn't feel about opponents is exactly what I feel about Donald Trump. How do you deal with the absolutists? And I'll say this, to me, what she described is it has been the genius of English politics for a long, long time. England has managed to find ways to reform itself. It's had what they refer to as revolutions, but I don't think, not like the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution or maybe even the American Revolution. But in any event, I'm not sure how to apply what she described now. The other thing I'll say is she articulated a point of view I could embrace, and there may be differences that conservatives and moderates and liberals might have as to how to accomplish the generalities that she articulated. But to me, she articulated the right objectives and generalities, which I don't know that conservatives in this country are yet where she is.